Yeah, I'm an ordained Episcopal / Anglican minister, and have served in a number of churches in Tennessee and Winter Park, Florida. And then I served as the first director of the Christian office at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, to establish that desk, which I did a few years ago. And since then I've been in the church, and just recently retired from parish ministry to begin working with Proclaiming Justice to the Nations as their program director.
You seem to have an understanding of the history of Christian anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
How did you come to that interest?
Well, the interest came because I came to my faith through a woman named Corrie ten Boom. She and her family helped save over 700 Jews from Nazi terror. They were a Dutch family, and Corrie and her sister Betsy both were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where Betsy died, and Corrie was released on a clerical error. She was supposed to be executed, but instead they filled out the wrong paperwork, and she went out and traveled around the world to share her story about her Holocaust experience, her love for the Jewish people and for Israel. And I, so to speak, inherited that from her, although I've always had an interest in the Jewish people and the relationship between Christians and Jews.
What is it in a Christian theology you think that has contributed to so much anti-Semitism through the ages?
Well, it actually started very early on in the church's history, even the early part of the 2nd century, when the church actually originally the church was a Jewish sect within Judaism, and over time it moved away from Jerusalem and became dominated by Gentiles. Well, for one reason or another, for lots of reasons, there's hostility between particularly Jewish believers and Jews who didn't believe, and this kind of was taken up by the Gentiles, who developed an understanding that they need to distance themselves from their Jewish roots by, for instance, changing the day of worship from Shabbat, from Sabbath, to Sunday, from discontinuing celebration of the biblical feasts and replacing them with Christian feasts, the equivalent of, for instance, Good Friday instead of Passover, and having Christmas and things like this that are not necessarily biblical feast days, but trying to remove any vestige of Judaism from the church. This is what I call anti-Judaism. And when you tend to be anti-Jewish, eventually you're going to be anti-Jew. You're going to have anti-Semitism, which happened in the church. And for 2,000 years, the history between Christians and the Jewish people is horrendous. Jesus made it clear that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. The Shema applies to Christians just as much as it does to Jews. So the idea that we would persecute anybody is foreign to the teachings of Jesus. So the whole history has been horrendous. And of course the most horrendous example of that is when Hitler took power, and without solid church opposition was able to murder 6 million innocent people. And I think that served as somewhat of an awakening to the church, that we've gotten things wrong. There's something wrong that this happened, and our hierarchy wasn't outspoken about it. But the actual theology that entered the church is something called replacement theology, or supersessionism. And the idea basically is that the Jews killed Jesus, therefore God is finished with the Jews. He's replaced Israel with the spiritual Israel, which is now the church. And there's various levels of that. The worst form is the Jews deserve everything that happens negative to them. Now, most aren't at that place. But even the idea that somehow that God's covenant with the Jewish people and His relationship with them, He said, I've loved you with an everlasting love. Well, the last time I checked out, everlasting means it never ends. He called Israel my firstborn son when He brought them out of Egypt. what father is going to completely reject his own children and adopt another people to be his own people? And Paul himself used an analogy of an olive tree, that the olive tree was Israel and wild branches were grafted in, and these wild branches were Gentiles who believed that Jesus is the Messiah and are grafted into this tree. So there's no biblical foundation for the idea that God rejected the Jewish people and all of a sudden just has this Gentile church.
What about these scriptural interpretations that say, his blood be upon them, referring to the Jews who were involved in...
Right. Yeah.
Is that something that you think is still upheld in certain church teachings?
Oh, yeah, I suspect so. There are a lot of scriptures that can be taken out of the context of the entire, both the Tanakh, or what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. You can just about prove anything you want to by picking and choosing your scriptures. But if you read particularly the prophets and God's relationship, and read about Abraham and his commitment to Abraham and his descendants, you can't reach that conclusion. And technically, Christian theology would say, yes, his blood be upon us, because it's by his blood, the shed blood, that we are forgiven of our sins. So, yeah, your example is well taken, because Christians have used things like that to say, well, they murdered him. But in actuality, they didn't. They were murdered by Romans. So it's problematic to suggest that his death was simply because the Jews wanted him murdered. They couldn't do it themselves, so they had to have complicity from the Romans. But in actuality, his death is what, from a Christian perspective, is what saves us from our sin. So he had to die. He knew when he went to Jerusalem, he knew he was going to die. He's told his disciples that. So this didn't come on as any kind of a surprise to him. He was painfully aware of what was going to happen, and he was willing to do it because he loved us so much.
What's your concern about how anti-Semitism is affecting politics towards the preservation and security of Israel as a Jewish state?
I'm extreme, as a person who was fortunate enough to live in Israel and have many dear Israeli friends, both Jew and Arab. I'm deeply concerned because anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, is reaching the same levels as it did in the 30s. If you look at the United Nations and the resolutions that they passed against Israel, it seems to be so skewed that pick on Israel but don't bring up what the Hamas does, or even the Palestinian, the PLO, and let alone Iran. When I talk to my beloved former assistant at Yad Vashem, and we talk every few weeks, that's always the topic, is Iran. What are they going to do? They feel threatened, and rightfully so, because this man has said what he's going to do. Just like Hitler said what he was going to do. The world didn't believe Hitler. Or is the world going to believe him? And I think we should, and we should stop him.
Do you see parallels between how the world reacted when Hitler just targeted the Jews when his goal was global domination?
Yes.
And what's happening now from the global jihad?
I absolutely do, especially when you think of what Chamberlain did in relationship to Hitler, was constantly appease, keep on talking, appeasing, and eventually we know what the outcome was. And at the same time, it's always talking to Iran, and I don't, as a pastor, no one wants to see war, but I also don't want to see 6 more million Jews slaughtered by a man who says that's what he's going to do. Israel does not want war with Iran. Israel does not want war with anyone. At Yad Vashem, I worked with a cross-section of Jews from just about every part, from secular to very religious. I didn't meet a single person there who hated the Arab people, who wanted they would do anything for peace, more than I would have been willing to do for peace. So the people of Israel and the way the kids are educated in Israel as opposed to the Palestinians and the way they educate their children makes me very nervous about what could happen to Israel.
What is your current mission? What would you
Our mission is to go to the church and to the secular world and bring the story of why the church should be interested in Israel, should support Israel, and to support the Jews who live in their community from any form of anti-Semitism. That's our primary, to educate the church, to get into their hearts and souls and teach them from our Bible, both the Tanakh, the Old Testament and the New Testament, what is God's relationship to the Jewish people? Has He forsaken them? Give me evidence. If you think that the church has replaced Israel, show me in the text where that comes from, and I'll show you why the opposite is true. And that's our mission. And Lori Cardozo-Moore, my president, is vehement in her support of Israel and the Jewish people, and is doing a marvelous work of which I'm privileged to be part of.
The organization called?
Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, pjtn.org.